One evening, Michelle, desperate to escape her chaotic home life, leaves her mother's house and begins hitchhiking. 15 years later, she's a successful bank manager. One morning, she tells her daughter, Brea, that she'll be busy after work and a babysitter will pick her up from school. At the front door, she runs into her brother, Dave, who tries to convince her to reconcile with her aging mother, but Michelle refuses. At work, Michelle meets with clients Sandy and Gris, a married couple. Gris notices a photo of Brea on Michelle's desk and asks about her family. Later, Michelle goes on a date with Joe, revealing how men often get intimidated by her daughter. After sending the babysitter away, Michelle reassures Brea, who's frightened by people outside the window. Later, from a car across the street, someone watches their house. The next day, Michelle, feeling unwell, presents the Employee of the Month award to Walter. That afternoon, an armored truck pulls up to the bank and a man in a nearby car takes note of its arrival time. That evening, while Michelle and Brea are watching a movie, masked intruders break in and overpower Michelle. They demand her help to rob the bank, revealing they have knowledge of her life and job. As Michelle struggles, she realizes one of the intruders is Chris, a bank client. He threatens her, insisting she cooperate. After some time, he lets Michelle untie Brea, but only after she agrees to help. Michelle attempts to escape by opening a window, but Chris catches her. He shows her dynamite and a remote detonator, warning her that any resistance will lead to violence. The intruders let Michelle and Brea sleep but monitor them closely. The next day, Chris forces Michelle to shower while he watches and straps explosives to both her and Brea. He informs her that the explosives can be detonated remotely and that a microphone is monitoring her every word. As the clock ticks down, the leader receives a radio call from his associates, reminding him that the armored truck will arrive in 45 minutes. Before leaving, Michelle tells Brea to stay brave. Once at the bank, Chris reminds Michelle that he can hear everything she says. He gives her 1 minute after her transaction with Reggie to hand over the money. Inside the bank, Michelle tells Reggie that she's in a hurry, which confuses both him and Rose as they usually have friendly banter. Outside, Chris observes Reggie and the guards leaving and concludes the transaction went smoothly. Inside the vault, Michelle covers Rose's mouth to keep her quiet and shows her the explosives. Rose tries to leave to warn others, but Michelle begs her not to cause a panic. She writes a note asking for help, warning that Brea's life is in danger. Michelle places the money in the bag and tells Rose that no one should enter the vault until she's gone, or else the intruders will kill Brea. Once Michelle returns to the car, she places the bag next to Chris and drives away from the bank. After confirming she did everything they wanted, Michelle asks Chris to remove the explosives from Brea, but he reminds her that he's still in charge. Meanwhile, back at the bank, Rose locks the doors and explains to the employees that Michelle took the money. Walter is suspicious but argues they shouldn't contact the authorities just yet. Rose insists they wait for Michelle to call. Chris orders Michelle to stop the car, get out, and drop to her knees. He makes her count to 50 before walking to her car, which she's going to park far away. After counting, Michelle removes the explosives and microphone from her body and runs to the car. Back at the bank, Walter grows concerned, but Rose finally agrees to call the authorities. When Michelle reaches her house, she finds Brea locked in a cabinet. She carefully removes the dynamite from her daughter and takes her to a neighbor's house to call the police. Detective Summers speaks to Michelle about the events, but when she asks if they'll be placed in protective custody, the detective explains that they can't authorize it yet. Confused, Michelle points out that they've been terrorized for 18 hours and the criminals are still at large. The detective explains that similar cases usually see the perpetrators long gone by now. Before leaving, Detective Summers tells Michelle to bring Brea to the station the next day for a statement. At the motel, Michelle locks the door and closes the curtains. When Brea begins crying, she asks why she's afraid to speak. Brea whispers that she's scared the bad men will hear her. Michelle comforts her and promises to tell her a bedtime story. Later, they hear men's voices in the hallway, but Brea eventually calms down as the voices fade. After Brea falls asleep, Michelle goes to the bathroom to wash her face. As she looks at herself in the mirror, she imagines seeing Chris sitting in a chair. Startled, she realizes it's just her imagination. She cries quietly, trying not to wake Brea, then calls Dave to tell him what happened. The next day, Michelle finds Brea drawing pictures of the 3 men outside their house. They hear a knock at the door, and Michelle is relieved to hear Dave's voice. He embraces them both and asks Brea if she wants a milkshake. Later, at the bank, Michelle sees the police taking photos and speaking with employees. Detective Summers suddenly asks if she discussed the robbery plan with Chris. Michelle repeats that she was forced to comply because they threatened to detonate explosives on her and Brea if she didn't. The detective points out that Michelle had several chances to alert the authorities but chose to take the money. Michelle explains there was a microphone under her clothes and Brea's life was at risk. The detective then reveals that the explosives were fake, just rolls of nickels painted to look like dynamite. Michelle insists that they felt heavy, but the detective confirms they weren't real. Later, Michelle tells Dave she can't return to the bank because everyone believes she's guilty. She doesn't know what to do as she can't go back to work and doesn't want to return home. Dave reassures her that she's strong and will find a way to make things right for Brea. At the police station, Detective Summers forbids Michelle from sitting in on Brea's therapy session. The detective later informs Michelle that one of the intruders left a fingerprint at the scene, and they matched it to a person named William Hastings, one of Chris' aliases. He had been convicted of 8 bank robberies but only served 5 years. Summers also mentions it's odd that the intruder introduced himself to Michelle the day before and even left his business card. Detective Summers continues to press Michelle about her financial situation, noting that despite being the manager of one of the largest banks in Southern California, she only has a few $1,000s in savings. Michelle explains that her ex-husband left her with significant debt, making it hard to save. Frustrated, the detective slams his notepad on the table, accusing Michelle of being involved in the crime due to her financial struggles, especially since she walked out of the bank with over $300,000. Michelle insists she had no part in the crime, emphasizing that she would never allow her daughter to be tormented by the captors. Later, Michelle is advised to hire a lawyer. Her therapist urges her not to bury the pain of the trauma, as it will only make it harder to heal. The doctor tells her it will take time for both her and Brea to recover, offering help if needed. At the motel, Michelle asks her brother why she needs a lawyer. He explains that the police often suspect innocent people and that she needs to know her rights. The news reports that the police have arrested the 3 men responsible for holding Michelle and her daughter hostage, much to Michelle's relief. Soon after, Michelle meets with the district attorney, who reveals that Chris had been romantically involved with Sandy, the bank manager. Michelle is appalled and denies the accusation, explaining that Sandy had been waiting in a car outside while her husband tortured them. Detective Summers presents provocative pictures of Michelle, which were found in Chris's possession. The exasperated manager admits she used to be an exotic dancer, but had quit 2 years ago before her marriage and long before having Brea. She had even requested that her photos be removed from the club's website, but they refused. The district attorney hints that the missing $160,000 could help pay off Michelle's debts, and Detective Summers advises her not to leave town. During a therapy session, Michelle admits that she struggles with sleep, still hearing the voices of the intruders at night. She sobs as she reflects on her promise to give her daughter a life free from trauma, but the therapist suggests that Michelle has to forgive her parents and not project her unresolved issues onto Brea. Detective Summers later informs Michelle that they recovered the rest of the stolen money, and the police no longer consider her a suspect. That evening, Michelle tells her brother that she had considered turning to people for money in the past, but ultimately turned her life around. She confesses that she had thought about leaving with Brea for a quiet life, but she realized that doing so would be no different than what their mother did. She just wanted to do her best for her children. Michelle and Brea move to a new apartment, and Michelle prepares to go to the courthouse. Brea proudly hands her a picture to keep for courage. At the courthouse, Michelle identifies Chris when asked who broke into her house. The district attorney assures her that she won't have to return until it's time for her testimony. During the trial, the defense lawyer argues that there was no kidnapping, suggesting that Michelle orchestrated the robbery with Chris because of their romantic relationship. The defense highlights Michelle's financial troubles, including the fact that she had only $700 to her name the night of the supposed attack, implying that she planned the robbery for financial gain. Michelle struggles with the pressure, but is advised by her lawyer not to become too loud or argumentative, as it could harm her case. During a break, the defense shows the jury Michelle's pictures from her past as an exotic dancer. Tearfully, Michelle insists that the day at the bank was the first time she met Chris, and she would never intentionally put her daughter's life in danger. She states that she would rather die than see Brea go through what they experienced. In the end, the jury finds Chris guilty of conspiracy to commit kidnapping for robbery, kidnapping for ransom, and first-degree robbery. During sentencing, Michelle gives a personal statement, telling Chris that she's choosing the high road and forgiving him. Days later, Michelle takes Brea to her mother's house, and they finally reconcile after decades of estrangement. Eventually, Michelle becomes an advocate for victims' rights, traveling across the country to speak about PTSD and violence against women and children.